With the release of the Super Famicom, Square was making big plans for the Final Fantasy franchise. The company wanted their flagship RPG series to catch up with their biggest rival, Dragon Quest, which had released its fourth entry in 1990. So in the wake of FF3 that same year, two new games were planned in tandem, Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom, and Final Fantasy V for the Super Famicom. But Square was soon struck pretty hard with the realization that they were spreading themselves too thin, and the Famicom entry was scrapped in favor of the more impressive next-gen console. This Famicom game was reportedly around 80% complete when it was abandoned, but many of its ideas would be carried over into the new game, which now took the mantle of being Final Fantasy IV. Series regulars Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshitaka Amano, and Nobuo Uematsu returned yet again, but with the departure of Nasir Jabeli after Final Fantasy III, programming duties would be passed on to Ken Narita, who had worked under Jabeli on the first three games but had thus far gone uncredited. Game designer Hiromichi Tanaka initially returned from FF3 as well, and proposed that the new game feature a much more cohesive and dynamic overworld, as well as abandon menu-based battles in favor of entirely real-time fights. But when it was brought to light that this wouldn't be easy to pull off even with all the new tech, Tanaka stepped down from the project and transferred to a separate team at Square, where his ideas would help form the basis of a Final Fantasy spin-off that would eventually become Secret of Mana. But taking Tanaka's place on the FF4 team would be Hiroyuki Ito, who had begun as a debugger and eventually sound programmer on the previous titles, before being promoted to lead game design here. Filling in for the absence of writer Kenji Terada would be Takashi Tokida, who would take a basic plot outline drafted by Sakaguchi and flesh it out considerably. So much so, in fact, that about 75% of his scripts had to be trimmed away simply for the sake of the game even fitting on a Super Famicom cartridge. The team combined what they felt were all the best aspects of the first three games into what they hoped would be their greatest yet, and Final Fantasy IV would see release in Japan on July 19, 1991. Final Fantasy IV stands out from the entries before it in several ways, though it may not seem that way at first. Visually, the game is barely a departure from the Famicom titles. It has more colors and uses Mode 7 in select spots. It has these neat see-through floors in a dungeon or two, and can use transparent effects for things like fog. But all in all, the graphics in FF4 can be best described as an 8-bit game on steroids, rather than feeling like a true 16-bit showcase. At least as far as the overworld goes. The battle scenes are really where the jump to the Super Famicom is made most apparent, featuring more detailed sprites and animations, and full backgrounds. And considering the battle scenes are where most of the game's action takes place anyway, it would be disingenuous to suggest that the game isn't graphically impressive for its time. There are even a few snazzy customization features, such as sliders that allow you to adjust the color of the menus. Outside of battles, though, the game carries over a lot of design and UI elements from FF3. You still have a limited inventory space and can still call the Fat Chocobo, the Sacred Bird, show some respect, at set spots to hold excess items. Your inventory also doesn't sort items in any particular order, it's all manual. While there is a sort option there, it doesn't change the current order of items, it only consolidates any duplicate items into the same slot to save space, which you also could just do manually anyway. And your magic list can't be automatically sorted in any way either. There's also no unequip option in the character menus, so if you ever want to unequip someone of all their gear, you have to select each piece one by one and replace them with an empty slot from your inventory, which is just... why? FF3 had an unequip option, so this definitely seems like a step back. And considering you still can't quickly switch from character to character, it makes any instance of juggling your party's equipment a pretty tedious process. Speaking of items and equipment, FF4 has plenty of rare items to get from enemy drops, including powerful equipment and even some extra summon spells. But the item drop rate in FF4 is abysmally low, about 5%. And on top of that, each enemy has 4 possible drops, with the rarest being a measly 0.4% chance. This means the rarest enemy drops are only going to show up, and I've done the math here, 0.08% of the time. And that's rounded up. That's less than 1 in 1,200. Granted, none of these items are required to finish the game, but several nifty items are only available as rare drops, including the item that earns you the strongest armor in the game. Ideally, you'd want 5 of those, but unfortunately they're only found as the rarest drop from the rarest enemy in one single room of the game's final dungeon. Unless you're a hardcore completionist, I'd say don't even bother. And hell, even if you are a completionist, this is one of the rare moments where I don't think anyone would blame you for just using a Game Shark, because who has that kind of time? Chocobo forests return, and now house white chocobos that will recover the party's MP. One specific forest also contains black chocobos, which can fly over anything except mountains, but can only land in forests. Save points are now a thing as well. You're no longer limited to saving the game only at inns or on the world map. There are now designated safe spots littered throughout dungeons and the like that allow the use of tents and the opportunity to save. And this makes dungeon treks considerably less harrowing than ever before. Save points would have been real useful in the final dungeon of FF3, but hey, it's better late than never. This also means that dungeons in FF4 are allowed to be longer and more difficult without feeling overly punishing or frustrating. The battle system is where Final Fantasy IV has seen the most overhauling from its predecessors. We're back to the singular MP pools per character like in FF2, and party size has been upped from 4 characters to 5. The front row back row system has been tweaked to match this increase in party size. The rows will always be a 3-to-2 split, so the player has to configure their current party to best fit those formations. But more important than that is what is by far the biggest contribution FF4 made to the franchise: the ATB system. ATB, short for Active Time Battle, is a battle system designed to incorporate an element of real-time action and quick thinking into an otherwise turn-based game. Rather than selecting all your actions at once and then just watching them play out one at a time, characters, both party members and enemies, are now granted turns in real time based on their speed stat, and actions will play out even as the player is selecting another. On top of this, some actions can also take additional time to charge after being chosen, such as high-level spells or certain special moves. This means that not only will faster characters literally be given more turns, it also means the player has to think and act on the fly, both to react to enemy moves and to quickly navigate through menus to get to the command they want, lest they waste time and give the enemies more opportunities to attack. Sometimes you'll even have to make the choice between a faster but weaker command or a stronger one that will take longer. It even affects the way the player chooses to sort items and spells, and even kind of explains why all the items and spells are sorted manually. Placing more useful or commonly used commands near the top of the list means less time will be spent scrolling through to find them. All of this results in a game where, despite still being turn-based, every second counts and every decision is important. The ATB system was conceived by Hiroyuki Ito and inspired by F1 racing, where faster racers can repeatedly pass or lap slower ones. The ATB system would prove to be FF4's defining mechanical element, and would be so well regarded as to be the default system for the next 5 mainline entries of the franchise. A few more additional tweaks were made to battles on account of the ATB system. You can pause for one thing, and party members' turns can be temporarily passed over at the press of a button, for those instances where the player wants a specific character to act before another. The defend command, which in FF3 was only available to certain jobs, is now available to every character, and forfeits their current turn in exchange for a boost in defense. The run command is no longer a menu option, but rather performed by holding down both shoulder buttons on the controller. Running now also carries the chance of the party dropping a small percentage of their gil. Not enough to be detrimental when done in moderation, but enough to punish those who flee too often, encouraging players to stick it out in all but the most desperate of battles. And it wouldn't just be the game designers getting used to the new potential of the Super Famicom. Music composer Nobuo Uematsu had to learn all the new sound equipment as he went, and he and the sound programmers would often stay overnight at the office just trying to get everything right. Thankfully, the final product does not disappoint, as FF4's soundtrack would be one of Uematsu's defining works. With nearly double the amount of sound channels to work with when compared to the Famicom, the composition of each piece was able to be significantly more complex. Returning tracks such as the Victory Fanfare and opening theme sound better than ever. And the classic Prelude even added a new movement with woodwinds and strings. The new overworld theme is mesmerizing. And when you fight Calcabrina and hear that creepy song for the first time, it's not something you soon forget. Battle with the Four Fiends needs no introduction, having been performed and covered by rock bands and symphonies alike. The theme of love would even become something of a cultural touchstone in Japan, being taught to Japanese schoolchildren as part of their music curriculum. As mentioned before, the dev team for FF4 took what they believed were the best elements from the first 3 games and reconfigured them into this one in new and interesting ways. Like in FF1, the plot of FF4 revolves around the 4 crystals and elemental fiends, this time with the fiends' names borrowed from Dante's Inferno. Like FF2, FF4 would place heavier focus on its characters and world, even more so than before, to the point where dialogue can now even play out on the battle screen. And from FF3, FF4 would take the job system. Or, well, it would take the jobs. There's no switching between classes in this one, and, well, let's talk about that. In the prior Final Fantasy games, your party was either the same 4 characters from beginning to end, like in 1 and 3, or 3 characters with a revolving door for the 4th slot as the story required, like in 2. In FF4, the only constant in your party is the main character, Cecil. And yes, that is the official pronunciation, I'm sorry. Every other party member is dictated by the plot at all times. On top of that, each character is given a set job or class that fits in with their backstory, and with one notable exception, that role never changes. Yang will always be a monk, Edward will always be a bard, Kain will always be a dragoon, etc. Typically, bosses are designed around this, essentially making every story-heavy battle into a puzzle to overcome with the setup you've been provided. But looking at the game with a wider lens, you really start to see how this sort of structure limits any real opportunity for the player to, well, decide things for themselves. In FF1, yeah, your party never changed, but you got to choose what that party was right at the start of the game. In FF2, your 3 regulars were blank slates, with a rotating slot 4 that would fill set roles as they came and went. And FF3 had the excellent job system, letting the player play around with a wide pantheon of possible party configurations. Final Fantasy IV, though, feels like the most restrictive FF yet. Not only is every character stuck in their set job no matter what, but your entire party is decided for you at every turn. And unlike the previous 3 games, magic isn't even bought at shops nor found in chests, but rather learned by the appropriate characters as they reach certain levels. This results in an RPG where it feels like all of the interesting choices you could make in terms of your party are already made for you, with no opportunities to break away and experiment like with FF2 and 3. Rosa will always be a white mage, and she'll always learn the same spells at the same levels. And much as the fans like to decry, say, FF13 for being seemingly terrified of letting the player make any of their own decisions, FF4 is honestly pretty restrictive as well. This also means that at any given point in FF4, the only way to remedy an instance where you're having trouble in battle is to grind. And while the linearity of FF4 always seems to gaslight me into remembering the game as being pretty easy, it's really not. It's actually pretty damn hard. Seriously, when I was taking notes while playing this game, I kept trying to pinpoint certain sections that felt like significant difficulty spikes, only to realize by the end that I had listed basically every major dungeon as being a difficulty spike. In FF3, if a certain dungeon or boss was giving you trouble, you had countless options for overcoming this. and experimenting with your jobs and equipment was hugely entertaining and fulfilling. But there's just none of that here. If your current setup is having trouble getting through a dungeon, well, you're gonna have to get through that dungeon regardless, since the story won't let you switch out any of your characters until it says so. So you're forced to either cope with the struggle or just grind EXP until your characters are strong enough. And if you know me, you know that's my least favorite type of RPG design. I prefer RPGs where clever decision-making and crafty party setups can be used to outsmart the game, but there's almost no opportunities for that here. FF4 represents the opposite of play smarter, not harder. There is no playing smarter here. There are a few clever moments, like the way the new float spell will protect your characters not only from earth-based attacks during battle, but also damaging floor tiles in dungeons. Or the way protecting yourself from even a single status ailment will make you completely immune to the Malboro's infamously inconvenient bad breath ability. But the vast majority of the time, you're gonna get through this game on nothing but determination and attrition, not witty strategies or clever team building. Any random playthrough of FF1 through 3 can play out very differently depending on the player's choices, but almost every playthrough of FF4 is probably gonna look pretty darn identical. And this lack of variety or player agency is honestly the game's biggest flaw for me. But despite me saying all that, I can never quite bring myself to dislike this game, and when I try to think of why that is, I only ever come to one conclusion. That being, even though you are kinda just riding the story's coattails with this one, said story is honestly really compelling, and it's filled with a rotating cast of genuinely likable characters. The main trio of Cecil, Kane, and Rosa enter the story with an established history that's clearly had its complications. And despite them obviously all caring for one another, Kane in particular seems to harbor some jealousy, and even resentment. A facet that plays heavily into the overall plot, don't you worry. Cecil, despite being well-meaning and competent, is insecure and self-aware about his role as a Dark Knight, and seeks to atone for the acts of cruelty he committed under the orders of his power-hungry king. Rydia is an incredibly sympathetic character. Sid is a tension breaker every time he speaks up, and Yang is just the embodiment of strength in every sense of the word. Even the cowardly Edward never truly crosses the line into being outright pathetic. And Palom and Porum, despite being a pair of bratty toddlers, possibly my least favorite character trope in fiction, surprisingly end up being really fun and wholesome, which makes this moment hit way harder than it should. And Edge... well, okay, Edge kinda sucks, but that's still a really good track record as far as characters go. Normally, I'd be kinda bothered by a game where the story imposes on the gameplay like this, but similar to how I feel about the first two Metal Gear Solid games, if the story is interesting enough, I'm willing to throw a lot of leeway in its direction. The game might not give the player much in terms of interesting choices to make, but it's not exactly like FF4 is on rails or anything. There are still more than a handful of opportunities for the player to break away from their immediate objective to complete side quests and the like, and the game spans 3 different world maps by the end. That being said, while I do believe the story of FF4 is good, it still has a few huge issues. Namely, it relies a bit too heavily on a handful of the same crutches over and over, which are almost always just there as a contrived way of getting characters in and out of your party. The game has no less than 2 instances of the party being separated after some catastrophe, and no less than 4, count 'em, 4 instances of a character nobly sacrificing themselves to save the party, only to then be revealed as perfectly fine hours later. Except for the one time where they were not, in fact, perfectly fine. Like, yeah, it's nice that these likable characters end up not actually being swatted down like flies left and right, but I can't imagine audiences in 1991 feeling any less cheated by fake-outs like this than we would be today. The story also really likes mind control. It has at least 2 instances of a mind-controlled character betraying the party, and then it's later revealed that the character doing said mind control was himself being mind-controlled. We also learned that not only is the main character the descendant of Moon People, but that the main villain was his long-lost brother all along, and so said villain immediately switches sides to help fight the actual villain, who comes out of nowhere and wasn't ever properly set up by the story before this. Between all of these repeating contrivances and ridiculous twists, the game almost comes off as parody, but no, it's played completely straight and presented so earnestly. This game is a melodramatic soap opera of an RPG, but damn it, it's just so charming that I can't help but love it. As stated before, the story was headed by Takashi Tokida, And in light of how the story of FF4 is presented, it perhaps isn't surprising to learn that Tokita had a background not in games, film, or even TV, but in theater. This is seen so clearly in his focus on interpersonal character drama. And FF4 even kind of fits the Shakespearean 5-act story structure if you squint hard enough. Kain in particular has one of the most compelling character arcs of any early RPG I can think of, being a layered character with complicated feelings about those he cares for, making for a good example of a character with genuine angst as opposed to just being a whiny edgelord or whatever. And the gameplay itself will even go out of the way to maintain a sense of continuity with the plot. For instance, most of your party members start with a few levels already under their belt, as most of the cast have backstories that involve them being experienced in combat. It wouldn't make sense for these supposedly hardened military soldiers to start at level 1, and so the game designers actually accounted for this. Probably my favorite instance of this sort of gameplay story coordination involves the character Tella and the Meteor spell. Meteor is set up as being this powerful last resort secret weapon, and using it causes great physical and mental stress on the caster. And even once Tella has finally learned Meteor, he will never have enough total MP for the player to actually be able to cast it. So when a cutscene plays out later on where Tella does cast Meteor, it literally kills him because he spent all his energy and then some just to get the spell to work. That kind of attention to detail is really cool, and it's something Square would excel at in FF entries moving forward. As I mentioned before, the story of FF4 was originally much more beefy and ambitious than what we eventually got. According to Square, Tokita's initial scripting treatment had to be trimmed down to roughly 1/4 of its original size in order to be viable for fitting on a Super Famicom cart. But Tokita has assured us that only the most unnecessary material was cut. Still, one can't help but wonder what some of the dropped story entailed. We know for a fact that Square initially planned a segment of the game where each party member would have to overcome a trial specific to them, and this idea would eventually be made reality in the Game Boy Advance release of the game. Other than that, we really don't seem to know much, but there is one moment in particular that always screamed cut content to me. Devil's Road, according to NPCs, is said to be a very treacherous subterranean tunnel linking the towns of Baron and Mysidia, and many have died there. When Baron's forces are ordered to invade Mysidia for their crystal in the game's prologue, they opt to do so via airship travel, one would assume because this Devil's Road is so dangerous. But when your party finds themselves in Mysidia and has to travel Devil's Road to get to Baron, nothing happens. It's just a warp point. Clearly, this was planned to be a full dungeon, but for whatever reason, it was apparently deemed unimportant enough to cut. I'm not exactly broken up about this, I just think it's a little strange, and it's probably the most obvious instance of where cuts had to be made. Honestly, I think Tokita was right when he said that only the necessary bits were left in the final game. This game's pacing is pretty darn perfect, and not one moment of the story feels like wasted time. And even still, they were able to have some fun and stick little Easter eggs in, like this part where you can visit the dev team's office. Stuff like that is just so endearing. Sure, certain story bits can seem a bit contrived or sudden, but at the same time, I'm not completely convinced that stretching out this story to 4 times its current length would actually have made it better in any significant way. A lot of RPG fans seem to have this belief that a story's quality is proportional to its length, but rarely have I found that to be true. I would rather have a shorter game that keeps me constantly entertained, rather than one that drags for dozens of hours longer than it needs to, just for the sake of, what, lore? World building? That stuff is nice, but it's not all that makes a good story. I'm a huge fan of concision and efficiency in storytelling, and Final Fantasy IV, as it is now, is all killer, no filler, and I think that's what makes replays of this game so enjoyable for me. Final Fantasy IV would be localized into English and released in November of 1991, meaning this was the first time a Final Fantasy game was released in Japan and America within the same year. Considering the US had skipped FF2 and 3, FF4 was retitled Final Fantasy II to avoid confusion. The English localization itself, though, was rough. In addition to a lot of the story's nuance being lost simply due to space limitations, a lot of instances of broken English or strange phrasing were present, and it feels like the script just wasn't proofread by anyone with a firm grasp on the language. Reportedly, the team was made to translate the game's scripts without ever actually being able to play the game and make sure it all made sense in context. The translation is commonly attributed to Ted Woolsey, the man who would be Square's go-to English translator throughout most of the 16-bit era. But this is a misconception. In truth, Woolsey didn't even work for Square yet at the time of FF4's original release. And in fact, Square only sought out a proper translation team led by a native English speaker because they specifically wanted to avoid their future games' English scripts being as choppy as FF4's. Aside from simple language issues though, the English version would also skirt around certain mentions of death or religion, such as the Holy Spell being renamed to White and the Tower of Prayers being called the Tower of Wishes. This was all standard operating procedure for Nintendo of America at the time. The ESRB wouldn't be established for another few years at this point, and so video games were a wild west in terms of content moderation. So Nintendo's strategy in this era was to play things as safe as they possibly could to avoid controversy and maintain their family-friendly image. And localizers' hands were often tied on this issue when dealing with games being released for Nintendo hardware, so I try to cut them a little slack. And the changes to FF4 in the States aren't limited to just localization. It was also somewhat simplified from the Japanese original, as Square feared that Americans would be overwhelmed by certain gameplay features in light of not having played FF2 or 3. In short, they removed certain items, commands, and even spells that they felt would complicate the game too much for Westerners. Some examples being the Spell in a Bottle items, Rosa's Prey ability, and the spells Protect, Shell, and Dispel. Which is weird, right? Americans essentially invented the RPG with Dungeons & Dragons, and FF1 sold better in the States than it did in Japan. I think it's pretty clear we could wrap our heads around this stuff even back then, even if the genre wasn't particularly popular. But hey, what do I know? For the sake of transparency, I'll point out that the version I'm playing here is actually a fan-made ROM hack of the American release that improved the translation and restored the cut features. But as far as official releases go, the closest North America ever got to a faithful, unaltered release of the original would be the PlayStation version released in 2001. Japan had also seen a simplified re-release of FF4, known as EasyType, about a month prior to the US release, and the American and EasyType versions of the game were developed at the same time. For a while, it was mistakenly believed that these two versions of the game were identical, but we now know they aren't. The US release was only made marginally easier than the original, but the EasyType version would truly live up to that name, by adding some new equipment, reducing shop prices, and speeding up the spellcasting times. And the back row now only benefits party members and not enemies. EasyType also uses simplified language and terminology, more clearly instructs the player on certain game mechanics, and even added dialogue in a few scenes to further clarify events that were originally more subtle. This was all done to better accommodate young children and those new to RPGs in general. Reception to Final Fantasy IV was largely positive on both sides of the Pacific, with America in particular seeing it as a huge leap forward given that they unknowingly skipped 2 entries. It's also left quite the legacy on the franchise, seeing numerous ports, re-releases, remakes, and sequels. One of Square's lead designers, Tetsuya Nomura, at one point cited it as his favorite entry. And many game devs, even outside of Square, revere FF4 as the game that popularized layered storytelling in RPGs. It successfully adapted Final Fantasy for the new 16-bit generation, and also cemented it in America as a franchise with potential. RPGs would remain niche in the West for a few more years to come, but FF4 was an important step in legitimizing them over here. And the first few games in the Saga franchise would take on the Final Fantasy moniker in the West to try to capitalize on this relative popularity. While I may find its gameplay pretty restrictive in the grand scheme of things, I still find myself returning to FF4 more than any other entry. It's my most replayed Final Fantasy, and I'm talking full beginning-to-end runs here. And I guess that's because sometimes it's kinda nice to have a game with a great story and likable cast where I don't have to think about what I'm doing all that much. And even though the game may lack complexity, it doesn't exactly lack difficulty, and that still makes casual playthroughs engaging even outside of just the writing. Final Fantasy IV is a great gateway to this series, and a great gateway to RPGs in general. FF1, 2, and 3 definitely have their perks, but FF4 is really where the franchise hit its stride and found its voice. And it would be the blueprint future FFs and RPGs as a whole would look back on for the better part of a decade.